For 23 years, they treated me like human trash. I watched my father hand over $80 million and the family empire to my brother. But as they kicked me to the curb, a lawyer appeared with a chilling truth. I'm not a Vanderbilt, and my real father just left me $1.5 billion. The humid June air in Manhattan felt heavy, but it was nothing compared to the weight in my chest. I eased my 2015 Ram 1500 into the line of gleaming Lamborghinis and Rolls-Royces lining the curb of Fifth Avenue. My truck's engine rattled a rhythmic metallic cough that sounded like a death rattle among the silent hum of German engineering. I ignored the sneers of the valets as I climbed out my work boots crunching on the pristine pavement of the Upper East Side. I was wearing my best jeans and a clean flannel, but compared to the sea of tuxedos and silk gowns, I might as well have been wearing a hazmat suit. I was 23 years old, and for every one of those years I had been the other Vanderbilt. My name is Jack, not Julian the Golden Boy, not Robert the Patriarch, just Jack. The elevator opened directly into the Vanderbilt penthouse. It was a cathedral of glass and white marble overlooking Central Park like a throne room. Today was the double celebration, Julian's graduation from Columbia, and the official announcement of the Vanderbilt succession. As I stepped inside, the music didn't stop, but the atmosphere curdled. My mother, Diane Vanderbilt, spotted me instantly. She was a woman who moved like a blade, sharp-cold and expensive. She intercepted me before I could reach the buffet. "What are you doing here, Jack?" she whispered, her voice a serrated edge. "And why are you dressed like a common laborer? You have grease under your fingernails." "I just finished a double shift at the Newark docks, Mom," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I didn't want to miss Julian's big moment. She didn't look at my face. She looked at my boots. "You smell like diesel and disappointment. Go stand by the kitchen door with the catering staff. If guests see you, tell them you're here to fix the plumbing. It's more believable than telling them you're my son." The words hit harder than any crate I'd ever hauled at the port. I walked to the back of the room, standing near the service entrance. The waiters, dressed in better suits than mine, gave me sympathetic glances. I stood there, a ghost in my own home, watching the man I called father take the stage. Robert Vanderbilt stood at the podium, a glass of vintage Cristal in his hand. He looked like the embodiment of New York power silver hair-tailored Brioni suit and a heart made of granite. "Friends, family, colleagues," Robert's voice boomed. "Today is a historic day for the Vanderbilt real estate empire. For 3 generations we have shaped the skyline of this city, and today I ensure that the future remains in capable hands." He turned to Julian, who was standing there with a smirk that cost more than my truck. Julian looked like a model for a yachting magazine, tan athletic and utterly devoid of empathy. "Julian," Robert continued, his voice thick with a pride he had never once shown me, "you have proven yourself. You have the vision, the pedigree, and the Vanderbilt blood. Today, I am officially handing over the keys to the kingdom. I am transferring $80 million in liquid assets and the title of CEO to you effective immediately." The room erupted in applause. People cheered, glasses clinked, and Diane rushed to embrace her favorite son. I watched from the shadows, my heart hollow. $80 million, a kingdom, and I was standing next to the trash cans. Robert's eyes finally drifted to the back of the room. He saw me. The pride vanished, replaced by a cold, simmering disdain. He didn't even acknowledge me as a guest. He used me as a cautionary tale. "Some are born to lead," Robert said into the microphone, his eyes locked on mine. "And some are born to serve. History only remembers the architects, not the men who carry the bricks." The sting was visceral. After the toast, the crowd moved toward the terrace for cigars. Robert walked toward me, not to welcome me, but to finish the job. Julian followed him, sipping his champagne. "You should leave, Jack," Robert said, his voice low so the guests wouldn't hear. "You're an eyesore. You've spent 5 years playing in the dirt at the docks, and you haven't learned a single thing about what it means to be a Vanderbilt." "I've learned how to work, Robert," I countered. "I've learned that your buildings don't stand up without the people you despise." Julian laughed, a sharp, condescending sound. Spoken like a true peasant Jack. You really think loading crates makes you important? You're a cog, I'm the engine. Dad's right, you don't belong in this room. You don't even belong in this zip code. Your brother has a future, Jack, Diane added, appearing at Robert's side. You have a shift at 4:00 a.m. Don't embarrass us further. Take your truck and get out. The valets are complaining about the oil leak on the driveway. Robert stepped closer, his face inches from mine. I've spent 23 years trying to find a spark of excellence in you. All I found was a man who likes the taste of dust. I'm done wasting the Vanderbilt name on you. He signaled to the 2 security guards standing near the door. They weren't there for the guests, they were there for me. Escort him out, Robert commanded. And Jack, don't bother coming back for the holidays. There's no room at the table for someone who refuses to be more than a common laborer. As the guards grabbed my arms, Julian leaned in his breath, smelling of expensive wine. Don't feel too bad, little brother, he hissed. Someone has to be the loser so the winner looks better. You were born to be a slave for people like me. Now go back to your Newark gutter where you belong. They pushed me into the elevator. The doors closed on the image of my family laughing, celebrating a fortune built on a name I was no longer allowed to carry. When I reached the lobby, the head security guard literally shoved me towards the street. You heard the boss. Move along, grease monkey. I stood on the sidewalk of Fifth Avenue, the cold wind whipping through my flannel shirt. I looked up at the glowing lights of the penthouse, feeling the absolute crushing weight of being nothing. I had no inheritance, no family, and no future. I walked toward my old Ram 1500, my boots heavy on the concrete. I didn't know then that the man I called father had just made the biggest mistake of his life. I didn't know that my 23 years of slavery were about to end and a billion-dollar war was about to begin. I reached for my door handle, but a hand stopped me. A man in a sharp charcoal gray suit was standing there holding a black leather folder. "Mr. Jack Miller?" the man asked. His voice was calm, professional, and carried the weight of a different kind of power. "It's Vanderbilt." I snapped, my voice raw with anger. The man smiled thinly, shaking his head. "No, sir, it's not. And thank God for that." I climbed into the cabin of my Ram 1500, the door slamming with a hollow metallic thud that echoed the emptiness in my chest. I slumped against the steering wheel, the scent of stale coffee and diesel fuel filling my senses, the only things I truly owned. Outside, the sky over Manhattan had turned a bruised purple, and then the rain started. It wasn't a gentle mist, it was a rhythmic, aggressive drumming against the rusted roof of the truck. Tap, 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 thud. The sound was hypnotic, a liquid percussion that seemed to mock the steady beating of my humiliated heart. I reached for the ignition, wanting nothing more than to disappear into the New York traffic, to vanish before the valet could sneer at me one last time. Suddenly, a sharp, rhythmic rapping on the driver's side window broke through the sound of the storm. Knock, knock, knock. It was a precise, authoritative sound, not the frantic tapping of a beggar or the aggressive pound of a cop. I rolled down the window. The rain splattered against the interior plastic, and the cold Atlantic wind surged in. Standing there, unfazed by the downpour, was the man in the charcoal suit. He didn't look like anyone from the Upper East Side. He looked like he was carved from Texas limestone. "Mr. Miller," he said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that cut through the thunder. "My name is Silas Thorne's lead counsel, but today I represent the estate of Tom Walker. We've been looking for you for a very long time. I told you my name is Vanderbilt." I spat, though the name felt like ash in my mouth. "And I don't want whatever you're selling." "You aren't a Vanderbilt, Jack," he said, his eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made the hair on my neck stand up. "You never were. Robert and Diane knew it. Julian knew it. And it's time you knew the truth." He handed me a thick black leather folder. The material was cold and pebbled under my calloused fingers. "Open it," he commanded. I took a deep breath, the sound of my own ragged inhalation loud in the cramped cabin. I gripped the edge of the heavy envelope inside. Rip. The sound of the thick, expensive paper tearing was like a gunshot in the quiet truck. It was a crisp, violent sound, the sound of one life ending and another beginning. I pulled out a stack of documents, the pages smelling of old ink and high-end legal offices. The first page was a DNA profile. My eyes blurred for a second, then sharpened. Probability of paternity 0.00% between Robert Vanderbilt and Jack Miller. Below it, another test. Probability of paternity 99. 99% between Thomas's Tom Walker and Jack Miller. Tom Walker was a Titan Jack, the lawyer said, leaning against my truck door as the rain soaked his expensive shoulders. He started with one truck in Houston and built Walker Energy into a global powerhouse. He was the man Robert Vanderbilt spent 30 years trying to emulate but could never surpass. I flipped the page, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. My eyes landed on the bold, typed numbers in the last will and testament. My breath hitched. Total liquid assets, $1,500,000. Corporate holdings, 100% ownership of Thorn Logistics and Global Shipping. $1.5 billion, I whispered, the number feeling heavy. Impossible, like a foreign language I suddenly understood. That is just the cash, Mr. Miller, the lawyer replied. Thorn Logistics handles 70% of the shipping routes that the Vanderbilt real estate empire relies on to move their construction materials. You don't just have money, you have the leash that holds their neck. I felt a strange cold shiver run down my spine. It wasn't from the rain. It was the sudden intoxicating realization of power. For 23 years I had been the grease monkey. I had been the disappointment. Now, I was the man who owned the very ground they built their towers on. But then I saw it. Tucked into the back of the folder was a smaller translucent blue envelope. It looked out of place among the heavy legal bond paper. I pulled it out, my fingers trembling slightly. The stationery bore the crest of a private law firm in downtown Manhattan, the same firm that represented the Vanderbilts. I opened it, the paper crinkling a dry, papery whisper that sounded like a secret being told. It was a letter dated 5 years ago. To the trustees of Walker Energy it began. This is to formally inquire about the status of the unclaimed heir provision. My client, Julian Vanderbilt, is prepared to offer information regarding the location and current status of the individual in exchange for a confidential settlement and a seat on your board. My blood turned to ice. The rain on the roof seemed to grow louder, more chaotic. Julian hadn't just been my brother. He had been my jailer. He had known. He had discovered who my real father was years ago, and instead of telling me he had tried to sell me out, he had kept me in that Newark gutter, making sure I stayed small, stayed poor, and stayed invisible so that I would never claim what was mine. He wanted me to be a slave, so he could be a king with no rivals. I looked at the letter, the ink slightly smeared where a drop of rain had fallen. This was the golden boy. This was the man who had just been given $80 million while I was kicked to the curb. He had played a game of chess while I didn't even know I was on the board. He tried to steal your birthright, Jack, the lawyer said, his voice softening. Your father Tom knew about Julian's interference. That's why he structured the will this way. He wanted to see if you would break under the Vanderbilt pressure or if you would become a Walker. He watched you work those docks. He watched you take their insults and keep your head down. He said a man who can handle the dirt is the only man who can handle the gold. I looked out through the windshield, the wipers swishing back and forth. Shuck, 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 clearing the rain only for it to blur again instantly. That was my life, a constant cycle of trying to see the truth through the storm of their lies. Julian didn't just want the money. He wanted to destroy me. He wanted to ensure that Silas Thorne's son never stood in a boardroom. He wanted to keep me loading crates for his company while he lived in the penthouse I should have owned. I gripped the steering wheel, the leather cracking under my strength. The humiliation of the last hour, the grease under my fingernails, the smell of diesel, the catering door, it all began to transform. The pain was still there, but it was being forged into something else. Something sharper. What do I have to do? I asked, my voice no longer cracking. It was steady now, vibrating with a new dark purpose. "The jet is waiting at Teterboro," the lawyer said, stepping back and opening the door for me. "The board of Thorne Logistics is convening in Houston tomorrow morning at 8:00 a.m. They're expecting their new chairman. Robert Vanderbilt thinks he gave Julian a kingdom today. He has no idea that he just handed you the keys to his execution." I stepped out of the truck, leaving the keys in the ignition. I didn't need the Ram 1500 anymore. I didn't need the Vanderbilt name. I looked up at the penthouse one last time, the gold lights shimmering through the rain. Julian, Robert, Diane, they thought they had won. They thought they had successfully thrown away the trash. But as I walked toward the sleek black town car waiting behind my truck, I realized they hadn't thrown me away. They had released me. The sound of the car door closing was a soft, expensive thump. It was the sound of silence. The sound of the storm finally being kept at bay. As we pulled away from the curb, leaving the Vanderbilt Empire in the rearview mirror, I opened the folder one more time. I looked at my father's name. Tom Walker. "Let's go to Houston," I said. "I have a debt to collect, and I intend to collect it with interest." The $1.5 billion wasn't a gift, it was a war chest, and the war was just beginning. The private Gulfstream G650 banked over the Gulf of Mexico, its engines humming with a whispered power that made the screams of the Newark docks feel like a lifetime ago. I stared at my reflection in the polished mahogany table of the cabin. My face was the same, but the eyes looking back were colder, harder. I was still wearing my flannel and my work boots that still carried the dried gray mud of the New Jersey shoreline, but I was currently sitting on 6,000 miles of Italian leather. "We're on final approach to Houston, Mr. Walker," the lawyer Miller said softly. He didn't call me Jack anymore. He didn't call me Vanderbilt. He used my father's name. As the wheels touched the tarmac at Hobby Airport, the humidity of Texas hit me like a physical wall. It was different from the stifling heat of New York. It smelled of ozone-scorched asphalt and money. Real money. Waiting on the runway was a fleet of black SUVs, their engines idling in a low, synchronized growl. We drove toward downtown, where the skyline rose out of the flat Texas plains like a monument to industrial ambition. At the center of it all was the Walker Tower, 60 stories of dark, reflective glass and steel. It was the nerve center of Thorne Logistics. When I stepped into the lobby, the air conditioning was so sharp it felt like a blade. The marble floors were vast, echoing every heavy thud of my boots. Thud, thud, thud. The sound was out of place in this temple of finance. People in three-piece suits stopped in their tracks. Secretaries froze. They saw a man who looked like he had just walked off a construction site, but he was being flanked by the company's top legal counsel. "The board is waiting in the stratosphere room," Miller whispered as the elevator bypassed 59 floors in seconds. The doors opened to a boardroom that felt like it was suspended in the clouds. 20 men and women, the titans of American logistics, sat around a table made of a single slab of ancient oak. At the head of the table was an empty chair, my father's chair. The room went silent as I walked in. I saw the skepticism in their eyes. I saw a silver-haired man near the front, clasping a gold fountain pen, look at my mud-caked boots with a familiar disdain. It was the same look Robert Vanderbilt had given me. "This is the heir?" the man asked, his voice dripping with skepticism. Tom Walker was a visionary. This boy looks like he's here to change the light bulbs. I didn't sit down. I walked straight to the massive digital map projected on the far wall. It displayed the current shipping routes for Thorne Logistics' North American fleet. My years at the Newark docks hadn't just been about hauling crates, they had been an education in the friction of the real world. I knew where the bottlenecks were because I had lived in them. "You're using a hub-and-spoke model for the Northeast Corridor," I said, my voice echoing in the sterile room. I didn't wait for an introduction. "You're routing all New England construction timber through the Elizabeth terminal to save on fuel taxes." And the silver-haired man blinked. "It's the most cost-effective strategy on paper." "On paper, maybe," I countered, stepping closer to the screen. I pointed to a specific junction. "But Elizabeth is currently undergoing a crane retrofit on piers 4 through 7. Your dwell time for offloading has jumped from 6 hours to 24. You have 100 trucks idling in a 5-mile radius burning 3 gallons of diesel an hour. You're losing $40,000 a day in late delivery penalties alone, not to mention the driver turnover because they're hitting their federal hours of service limits while sitting in traffic. The room became deathly quiet. These people looked at spreadsheets. I looked at the dirt. Redirect the New England flow to the Port of Providence, I commanded. The draft is deep enough for the 3,000 TEU ships, and their rail-to-ship intermodal transition is 20% faster. You'll bypass the Elizabeth bottleneck entirely. You'll save 3 days on the total transit time and cut your drayage costs by 15%. The silver-haired man dropped his pen. It hit the oak table with a sharp clack. He looked at the map, then back at me. He wasn't looking at my boots anymore. He was looking at my mind. Providence is currently underutilized, he muttered, his eyes widening. He's right. Why didn't we see that? Because you haven't stood on a dock in 20 years, I said, finally sitting in the head chair. My father knew that. He knew that to lead this company you had to understand the grease and the grit, not just the dividends. Miller stepped forward and placed a small wooden box in front of me. Your father left this for your arrival at the office, Jack. I opened the box. Inside was a stack of grainy black and white photographs. I picked up the first one. My heart stopped. It was a photo of me at 10 years old playing baseball in a muddy field in Connecticut. I was pitching. My father, Robert Vanderbilt, wasn't in the stands, but in the background of the photo, leaning against a nondescript sedan, was a man in a Stetson hat. Tom Walker. I flipped to the next photo. It was me, at 18 graduating high school. Again, in the far distance, the same man. Then a photo from 6 months ago, me at the Newark docks, sweat-soaked and exhausted, leaning against a shipping container. The container had the Thorn Logistics logo on it. A small note was tucked into the bottom of the box. The handwriting was bold, shaky, but certain. Jack, I never missed a game. I never missed a milestone. I couldn't bring you into my world yet because the Vanderbilts would have used you as a pawn to get to me. I had to wait for you to become a man they couldn't break. You loaded my ships for 3 years without knowing I was watching. You didn't complain. You worked. Now, you don't just have my money. You have my respect. Use the empire I built to remind them who you are. Love your father, Tom. A lump formed in my throat, a mix of grief and a sudden, overwhelming sense of belonging. I hadn't been an afterthought. I hadn't been a mistake. I had been a project, a masterpiece of character building that Tom Walker had spent 2 Thap Key curating. I looked up at the board members. They were all standing now. Not out of obligation, but out of genuine, hard-earned respect. The Vanderbilt real estate empire. I said, my voice cold and focused. They have a massive development project starting in Queens next month. 10 luxury towers. They've already signed the intent-to-ship contracts with our Northeast division, haven't they? Yes, Mr. Walker, the silver-haired man said. It's their biggest project in a decade. If it fails, their holding company collapses. Good, I said, a dark smile spreading across my face. Prepare the legal team. We're going to audit every single one of those contracts, and then we're going to invoke the right of first refusal clause on their shipping lanes. I want to see Robert Vanderbilt's face when he realizes he can't move a single brick in the city of New York without my permission. I leaned back in the chair that felt like it was made for me. The mud on my boots was starting to dry and flake off onto the expensive rug, but I didn't care. The Thome from Newark was gone. The chairman of Thorn Logistics had arrived. Miller, I called out. Yes, sir. Book a flight for the Vanderbilt Board of Directors. Tell them the new owner of their primary logistics provider wants a meeting. In Houston. Tell them if they aren't here by Friday, I'll park their supply chain in the middle of the Atlantic. The war had moved from the gutters of New Jersey to the skyscrapers of Texas. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't just a cog in the machine. I was the one with my hand on the lever. The humidity in Houston was thick enough to choke a man. But inside the Thorn Tower penthouse office, the air was a surgical, frozen stillness. I sat behind the massive oak desk, my back to the door, staring out at the hazy horizon where my father's oil refineries met the Texas sky. On the desk sat a single item, my old laminated ID badge from the Newark docks. The plastic was cracked, and the edges were scorched from an engine fire I'd fought 2 winters ago. It looked like trash. It was the only thing in this room that felt real. The heavy mahogany doors behind me groaned open. The sound of footsteps on the polished marble was frantic, uneven, and desperate. I didn't turn around. I wanted to smell the fear first. "Mr. Walker, thank you for seeing us on such short notice." Robert Vanderbilt's voice crackled. It wasn't the voice of the Titan who had stood on the Upper East Side podium 2 weeks ago. It was the voice of a man drowning. "We represent Vanderbilt Real Estate. We are facing a temporary liquidity crisis. A misunderstanding with our creditors. $150 million is a very large misunderstanding, Robert," I said, pitching my voice low. I felt the vibration of my own power in my chest. "We were blindsided." Julian's voice added his tone oily and practiced, though I could hear the tremor in his breathing. "The logistics contracts for our Queens project were spiked. Our supply lines are frozen. We just need a bridge loan and a restoration of shipping priority. We're prepared to offer a significant equity stake." I slowly swiveled the chair around. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the kind of silence that happens right before an avalanche. Robert's face went from a desperate forced smile to a ghostly translucent white. His jaw didn't just drop. It seemed to hang uselessly. Julian's eyes bulged, his face twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. I leaned forward, clasping my hands on the desk. "Hello, Robert. Hello, Julian. I hope the flight from New York wasn't too cramped." "Jack." Robert whispered, his hands shaking so violently he had to grip the back of a chair. What is this? Why are you in Tom Walker's office?" "I'm not in his office, Robert," I said, my voice as cold as a Houston ice storm. "I'm in my office. I am the chairman of Thorne Logistics. I am the owner of the debt you've been running from, and I am the man who decided to stop your ships." Julian was the first to recover his survival instinct, kicking in with a sickening, slimy speed. He rushed toward the desk, a pathetic fake grin plastered on his face. "Jack, my god brother, this is incredible. Why didn't you say anything? We had no idea. Look, if we'd known you were the one behind Thorne, that whole graduation thing, it was just a misunderstanding. Dad was under a lot of stress. We're family, Jack. Blood is thicker than water, right?" He reached out as if to pat my shoulder, but I didn't move. I just looked at his hand until he slowly, awkwardly pulled it back. "Family?" I asked, a dark laugh bubbling up in my throat. "Is that what we were? Because for 23 years I thought I was a cog. I thought I was human trash, born to be a slave for people like you. Isn't that what you told me on the sidewalk in the rain, Julian?" "I was joking," Julian cried, his voice hitting a shrill, desperate note. "Brotherly ribbing. You know how it is, but look at us now. The Vanderbilt name and the Walker fortune, we could own the world. Just sign the debt waiver, Jack. Save the family, save your father's legacy." "My father's legacy is doing just fine," I said, gesturing to the skyscrapers outside. "But Robert's legacy, that's a different story." I turned my gaze to Robert. He looked ancient. The silver hair that used to signify power now just looked like the ash of a burnt-out fire. "You kicked me out because I wasn't an architect, Robert. You said I liked the taste of dust. Well, it turns out I've been eating your dust for decades, and it's made me very, very hungry." "Jack, please," Robert stanimered. "The company, it's everything. If we go under Diane, the estate, the name, it all vanishes. We did what we thought was best for the brand. We didn't know you were Tom's son. If you had known, you would have used me even sooner," I interrupted. "But Julian did know." Robert froze. He turned his head slowly to look at his golden boy. "What?" I pulled a second folder from the drawer, the blue translucent one I'd found in New York. I slid a series of bank statements and encrypted emails across the desk. Julian didn't just know I was an heir, Robert, I said, watching Julian's face turn from white to a sickly bruised purple. He's been working against you for 5 years. While you were grooming him to take over, he was shorting Vanderbilt stock through offshore accounts. He knew the Queen's project was going to fail because he was the one who leaked the internal cost overruns to the auditors. He wanted the company to collapse so he could buy it back for pennies, using the money he'd stolen from your private accounts. Robert grabbed the papers, his eyes scanning the numbers. He saw the wire transfers. He saw the emails Julian had sent to Thorn Logistics as previous board members trying to sell my location in exchange for a kickback. Julian, Robert's voice was a broken whimper. You sabotaged the Queen's permits. You're the reason the creditors pulled out. Dad, he's lying. Julian screamed, his composure shattering. He lunged for the papers, but I swiped them away. He's just trying to turn us against each other. He's jealous. He's always been jealous of me. I'm not jealous of a vulture, Julian, I said. I found the digital trail. You were so busy trying to bury me that you forgot I know how to dig. You didn't realize that the company you were trying to sell my secrets to was the company I was born to lead. Robert dropped the papers. He looked at Julian as if he were seeing a monster. The betrayal was so deep, so absolute, that it seemed to physically shrink him. He fell back into a chair, his eyes hollow. He had spent his entire life building a kingdom for a son who was currently picking the locks of the treasury. I gave you everything, Robert whispered to Julian. I gave you my name. I gave you Jack's share. I turned a blind eye to your cruelty because I thought you had the Vanderbilt heart. And all this time, you were gutting me from the inside. Julian realized the game was over. The fake smile vanished, replaced by a snarling, cornered animal rage. He looked at Robert with pure contempt. Your name is a dying brand, old man. You were too slow, too soft. You were obsessed with legacy while the world moved on. I wasn't going to wait for you to die to get what was mine. I was just taking a shortcut. Julian then turned to me, his teeth bared. And you think you've won? You're still just a dock worker in a fancy chair? You don't have the stomach for this. Give us the loan, or I'll drag this through the courts for a decade. I'll ruin the Thorn name before I let you enjoy a penny of it. I stared at him for a long silent moment. Then I reached out and picked up my old Newark ID badge. I stood up, walked around the desk, and stood directly in front of them. You told me I was born to be a slave, Julian, I said quietly. You told me I was human trash. I tossed the cracked, dirty ID badge onto the table. It slid across the expensive wood and stopped right in front of Robert's shaking hands. The badge represents 3 years of double shifts, I said. It represents every insult you threw at me every night I slept in my truck because I was too tired to drive, and every drop of sweat you thought made me less than you. To you, this is rack roué, but to me, this is the receipt for my soul. I leaned down, my face inches from Julian's. I didn't use my father's billions to buy your company, Julian. I used the knowledge I gained while wearing that badge. I knew your shipping routes were vulnerable because I was the one loading the trucks. I knew your managers were skimming because I was the one they tried to bribe. I bought your debt for 80 cents on the dollar 2 days ago. What? Robert gasped. I own you, I said, the words echoing like a gavel. I own the penthouse. I own the Vanderbilt offices. I own the cars, the planes, and the very clothes you're wearing right now. You came here to ask for a loan, but you're not getting a loan. You're getting an eviction notice. You can't do this, Julian yelled, grabbing the edge of the desk. I already did, I said. The Vanderbilt real estate empire is being liquidated. The assets will be absorbed into Thorn Logistics. Robert, you'll be allowed to keep your pension. It's more than you ever gave me. But Julian, you're done. I've already handed the evidence of your embezzlement to the DA in New York. There's a car waiting downstairs, but it's not taking you back to the airport. It's taking you to the precinct. The doors opened. 2 of my security team, looking like the granite towers of Houston, stepped inside. They didn't look at Robert. They walked straight to Julian. Wait, Jack? We can talk about this, Julian screamed as they hoisted him up by his silk-covered arms. "We're brothers, Jack." "We were never brothers, Julian," I said, turning my back on him. "Brothers don't sell each other's lives. They don't build thrones on each other's backs." As they dragged a sobbing, cursing Julian out of the office, Robert remained in the chair. He looked at the ID badge on the desk. He reached out a trembling hand and touched the cracked plastic. "I was wrong," Robert said, his voice a ghost of a sound. "The architect doesn't build the tower. The man who carries the bricks does, because he's the only one who knows how to tear it down." "Goodbye, Robert," I said. "There's a flight back to New Jersey in 2 hours. Coach, I think it's time you learned what the rest of the world feels like." Robert stood up, his dignity stripped away, and walked out the door without looking back. I was alone in the office. The silence returned, but it wasn't heavy anymore. It was light. I picked up the ID badge and put it back in my pocket. I looked out at the city, at the empire that was finally, truly mine. My father, Tom Walker, had watched me for 20 years. He had waited for me to prove I was more than a name. And as the sun began to set over Houston, painting the world in gold and fire, I finally knew why he had stayed in the shadows. He didn't want to give me a fortune. He wanted to give me a victory. I picked up the phone on my desk. "Miller, start the paperwork for the Queens Project. We're going to finish those towers, but we're going to do it right. And call the Newark docks. Tell Eddie and the boys I'm sending a fleet of new cranes. It's time the people who carry the bricks got a raise." I hung up, leaned back, and for the first time in 23 years I breathed. The dust had settled, but the work was just beginning. In the aftermath of the Vanderbilt collapse, the legal sharks had circled expecting a bloodbath. They expected me to strip the Vanderbilt name from the skyline and leave Robert and Diane to the mercy of the New York streets. But that wasn't the Walker way. My father Tom hadn't built an empire by being petty. He built it by being precise. I sat in my Houston office reviewing the final restructuring papers. Robert and Diane were allowed to keep their modest retirement home in Connecticut, a far cry from the Fifth Avenue penthouse, but enough to live with dignity. Robert had become a shadow, a man who spent his days staring at the garden, finally realizing that his legacy was a house of cards. Diane, for the first time in her life, was learning to cook her own meals and drive a car that didn't come with a chauffeur. It wasn't cruelty, it was reality. But then there was Julian. The DA had enough evidence to put him away for a decade for embezzlement and corporate fraud. He was looking at a gray cell and a life of disgrace. I could have let the gates of Rikers Island swallow him whole. Instead, I made a phone call. I offered him a life debt contract, a legal maneuver my father's lawyers had perfected for those who owed the company more than they could ever pay. "Sign this," I had told Julian in the holding cell, "and the charges are deferred. You won't go to prison." Julian, his silk shirt stained with sweat and his eyes wide with the terror of a pampered animal, grabbed the pen. "Anything, Jack, please. I'll do anything." He didn't read the fine print. 3 weeks later, I stood on the deck of a Thorn energy supply ship cutting through the choppy slate-gray waters of the Gulf of Mexico. We were 50 miles offshore, approaching Rig 42, a massive iron beast that stood in the middle of the ocean, screaming with the sound of industrial drills and crashing waves. I looked down at the manifest. Julian Vanderbilt was no longer a CEO. He was Roustabout Hash 4092. As I stepped onto the rig, the heat was a physical blow. It was 105 degrees and the air was thick with the smell of crude oil and salt. There was no air conditioning here, no vintage Cristal, no silk sheets, just the relentless roar of the machinery and the smell of hard, honest work. I found him on the lower deck hauling heavy drill pipes. Julian was unrecognizable. His designer tan had been replaced by a deep, angry sunburn and a layer of grease that no amount of scrubbing would ever truly remove. His hands, once soft and used only for signing checks, were a mass of blisters and black oil. He was struggling, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he tried to keep up with a veteran crew that didn't care about his last name. I leaned against the railing, watching him for a long time. When the shift whistle finally blew a piercing metallic scream, Julian collapsed against a bulkhead, shaking. He looked up and saw me. The old Julian would have snarled. He would have cursed. But this version of him, the one who had spent 14 hours a day for 21 days straight hauling iron, just stared at me with hollow eyes. You came to watch me crawl." He croaked, his voice raw from the salt air. "No," I said, tossing him a cold bottle of water. He caught it with trembling hands and drank like he had been wandering a desert. "I came to see if you'd learned anything. I lived this for 5 years, Julian. You called it slavery. I called it an education." "It's hell," he whispered. "It's life," I countered. "The people on this rig, the people at the Newark docks, they are the ones who built the world you thought you owned. You treated them like cogs. Now you know what it feels like to be the steel that keeps the machine running. If you finish your 1-year contract without quitting, I'll clear the rest of your debt. You'll have enough to start over, not as a Vanderbilt, but as a man." Julian looked at his scarred hands, then back at the drill floor. He didn't say thank you. He didn't have the energy. But for the first time in his life, there was no lie in his eyes. He stood up, wiped the grease across his forehead, and walked toward the mess hall to eat a meal he had actually earned. I left the rig as the sun began to dip below the horizon. The revenge I had imagined for years, the shouting, the public shaming, the dramatic downfall felt small compared to this. I hadn't broken Julian. I was giving him the only thing Robert never could have chanced to build a character that wasn't a facade. A week later, I was back on the East Coast. I stood on the bow of a Thorn container ship as it pulled out of New York Harbor, heading for the Atlantic crossing. Behind me, the Manhattan skyline was a jagged crown of glass and light. I could see the Vanderbilt towers now bearing the Thorn logo, being finished with the best materials and the highest safety standards in the industry. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the old Newark ID badge. It had been my anchor for so long, a reminder of who I was when the world told me I was nothing. I looked at it one last time, then let it slip from my fingers. It hit the water with a tiny splash and vanished into the deep dark blue of the Atlantic. I didn't need the anchor anymore. I had the ship. My phone buzzed. It was a message from Miller in Houston. "Queens project ahead of schedule. Profits for Q3 projected to break all-time records. You're being invited to speak at the Global Logistics Summit. They're calling you the billionaire foreman?" I smiled, looking out at the endless horizon. The wind was cold, but it felt like freedom. 23 years ago, I was a mistake. 5 years ago, I was a laborer. Today, I was the man who owned the horizon. Robert Vanderbilt thought he was protecting a name, but he was only protecting a shadow. My real father, Tom Walker, knew that names are just words. It's the work that makes the man. I looked at my own hands. They were clean now, the grease long gone, but the calluses remained. They were my true inheritance. The ship moved forward, steady and powerful, cutting through the waves with a purpose that no storm could shaken. I thought about a quote I'd seen once in a dusty book back in that Newark warehouse, something that finally made sense now that I was standing on the deck of my own destiny. I took a deep breath of the salt air, feeling the immense crushing weight of success, not as a burden, but as a fuel. I had been discarded like trash, only to realize I was the gold they were too blind to see. I turned my back on the New York skyline and looked toward the open sea. Julian was on a rig, Robert was in a garden, and I was exactly where I was meant to be. Because in the end I realized they were right about one thing: I wasn't like them. I was better. I was a walker. And as we headed into the rising sun, I whispered the only truth that mattered in the world of empires and icons. The best revenge is massive success.